Welcome to Fight Network Boxing Weekly. Corey Erdman and Morgan Campbell here with you. Happy New Year to everyone out there. Let's ring the bell for a good 2016. All right, so Morgan, you were on the phone to do this show. You were in the Windy City last week.
Yep.
We spent a good chunk of last week's program talking about the impending return of Ibeabuchi, who is out of federal prison and is looking to make a return to the boxing ring.
And the immigration hold has been cleared up.
That has been cleared as well.
Somehow, incredibly.
So somehow he's back in Nevada, where the crimes were committed, and has signed with Michael Kahns, the advisor to Manny Pacquiao.
Signed with MP Promotions
as well.
That's right,
MP Promotions.
And that's an important point.
Right, so he is under the umbrella now of Manny Pacquiao. That is a piece of information we didn't have when we spoke about this last week. Now, also last week, we were talking about the fact that Bob Arum, that Michael Kahns, that Manny Pacquiao, and Ibeabuchi all said, we want him to fight a top 15 heavyweight right out of the gate. And you and I said that's ridiculous.
Yes.
And it is ridiculous for a variety of reasons that we'll get into. And I still don't know if they're lying or not.
Yes.
But there are some indications that maybe they aren't, because the fight that is being talked about now for the undercard of Manny Pacquiao and Timothy Bradley 3 is Ibeabuchi versus an actual top 15 heavyweight, at least in certain sanctioning bodies, Andy Ruiz.
I mean, there's two ways to look at it, and I don't know how Team Pacquiao is going to spin this, because again, we have Pacquiao, who spent a considerable amount of time and energy positioning himself as the morally upright counter to Floyd Mayweather's wife-beating sleaze. Okay, cool. But now, again, as we mentioned last week, in putting a 43-year-old convicted rapist who hasn't been in the ring in 17 years, who probably is suffering from mental illness, putting him in the ring, Manny Pacquiao is just aligning himself with all of the worst of boxing. And there is like a pretty strong, almost human trafficking undercurrent that runs through this sport, because there's all kinds of people in fights that they shouldn't be in, but it's easy, it's convenient, it's a way to get wins for your fighter, and this is how these mismatches take place. And there's all kinds of fighters who are too old to be fighting drug-addicted fighters like the guy we keep bringing up, Antoine Eccles. Right. Pacquiao and Arum and Kahns have positioned themselves as being above all this and portrayed themselves being above all this. But in signing Ibeabuchi and putting him in the ring with Andy Ruiz, they've shown that they're not above any of this. And they're just as sleazy, just as cynical, just as opportunistic as anyone else in boxing. Now, this doesn't make them unusual in the world of boxing.
Not at all.
But just don't pretend that you're better, because you're not. They're not different from the people in Hungary sending guys over here to get beat up by the prospects from Montreal. They're not different from the guys in Latvia doing the same thing. No, and we've seen this. We see this all the time. When you position yourself, when you put yourself, in a position of moral authority, suddenly everything that you do goes on trial because you asked for it. Yes.
You open this up. You put everyone else on the stand for what they're doing, and then look at what you're doing. And just to recap who they're signing here, Ibeabuchi, and again, there is on one end, the guy served his time and he is free to go out and try and work.
Yes.
Sure. But you mentioned the history of mental illness. This is a guy who attempted to commit suicide with a 15-year-old in the passenger seat and paralyzed him.
This is an attempted murder-suicide, suicide-murder.
And then the sexual assault that he served 20 years for.
Either way, he willfully injured a child.
Correct. Willfully
injured a child.
And this is a guy who has pulled a knife on HBO executives in the past. This is a guy who legitimately thinks he's the president.
Yes. And we don't know the president of what.
Of what? I don't know. But he asked to be referred to as the president.
Right.
An actual court-documented history of mental illness. This isn't just us saying, Ibeabuchi, that guy's crazy, man.
Exactly.
No. He's clinically ill.
Yes.
And we're signing a guy that hasn't done anything physically active outside of the prison walls and the yard in 20 years. And the first fight we're going to put him in is against Andy Ruiz. And, in some way, this is kind of clever, because when they make this fight, people will see the picture of Ibeabuchi. He might still be in decent shape, and you'll see Andy Ruiz. Now, Andy Ruiz isn't the most aesthetically pleasing heavyweight. He's a guy with some extra poundage, but this is still a real fighter.
Yes.
But the optics might look like, oh, they're giving Ibeabuchi, this fat guy,
Yes.
To beat up in his first fight. When in reality, the opposite's going to happen. Ibeabuchi probably gets knocked out.
It looks like a competitor. It looks like a competitive
Right.
fight when you stand two guys next to each other. Now, Ibeabuchi's still undefeated.
Yes.
So now we have
Right.
undefeated
Ibeabuchi.
battle of undefeated heavyweights. So on paper, and yeah, on the scale at the weigh-in, when you take into account one guy's age and inactivity, it looks even. But yeah, it's not even, and maybe Manny Pacquiao, if Ike Ibeabuchi gets hurt, because the thing is, Ike Ibeabuchi is a danger to himself at this point.
Yes.
He's a danger to himself, but it's in
Inside and out of the ring.
Yes, in a lot of jurisdictions, it's easy to get a boxing license. But he's still a danger to himself because he's been out of the ring for so long, and because his brain does not work the way it's supposed to work. And I'm not a neurologist, but I don't think you need to be a neurologist to understand that when your brain doesn't work the way it's supposed to work, getting hit in the head more is not going to help the situation. It's only going to hurt it.
Listen, the Nevada Commission has been under scrutiny for a variety of things in the past when it comes to drug testing. They're always going to be under the microscope because they are the hub of fighting of all kinds. But they're going to be in a position now where they'll have the decision whether to sanction a guy that just got out of prison there, the crime he committed there, whether to sanction this guy or not. And I think that this is a pretty monumental ruling for them.
And again, prison, you can give a guy a license if he's been to prison.
Of course you can, yeah.
Mike Tyson got a license. All kinds of fighters.
Dwight Muhammad Qawi, James Scott, Bernard Hopkins,
boxing is a job. It's not different from any other job.
Yes.
And no one's going to stop you from being eligible to work just because you've been in trouble, just because you're an ex-convict. But again, when you add up the fact that he hasn't fought in 15 years and add in the fact that he has a documented history of mental illness, that's when it gets really, 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 really murky.
Yes.
About whether or not you should give this man a license. And again, because the other thing is that it's up to each promoter. And the difference between Mayweather and Ibeabuchi, or even Tyson and Ibeabuchi, because Tyson was a guy coming off of a rape conviction and a prison sentence. But each of those guys, Tyson, Mayweather, were also extremely marketable and still had, Mayweather more so than Tyson, still had a skill set to bring to bear.
And were physically and mentally able to take part in the sport.
Whereas you're taking Ibeabuchi from 15 years of inactivity and not just putting him on a card somewhere small, but on one of the 2 or 3 biggest boxing events of the year.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
And this thing can go wrong in any number of ways. And again, very quickly, Manny Pacquiao goes from Mr. Everything That's Right About Boxing to a party to everything that's wrong about boxing on a big scale. Because you see these fights take place. Burt Cooper, if he wanted to, could go get a fight.
Yeah, and he does.
Right, but he's fighting in Evansville, Indiana. He's fighting in West Virginia, places like that. He's not fighting on the undercard of a major pay-per-view event.
But nobody's going to look into this. I mean, Pacquiao is a party in this.
Yes.
But he will be far enough removed that people won't, the majority of people, unless you're in boxing, unless you're watching this show, unless you're really reading about this and following it, you probably don't even know that there is that connection. You know, Manny can get away with that in the same way that Manny's gotten away with all kinds of things that would fly in the face of the image that he tries to portray. He will get away with this as well. If Ibeabuchi gets starched in the middle of the ring and it's a disaster, this whole thing turns out to be a disaster, it will not fall on Manny Pacquiao at all. I will blame him. I will blame him.
Incredibly, it won't fall on Manny Pacquiao because they'll be able to play it both ways. If Ibeabuchi, if he gets hurt, or I think what's even worse for Ibeabuchi is if he wins, because then he'll keep fighting.
Yes.
Right? So it's either, because this is an ugly story either way. So, but you won't see it spun as Manny Pacquiao helping facilitate this. It'll be, Manny Pacquiao is just the titular head of this organization. There's other people making all the decisions, which flies in the face of Manny Pacquiao being this person who does more than box and controls his own affairs.
I mean, this is just...
You can't have both storylines at once.
No. But this is just one of a handful of fights under the HBO umbrella that have been rumored or scheduled. And coming up after the break, we'll go through some of those as the 2016 boxing calendar starts to fill up. We'll be back with more here on Fight Network Boxing Weekly. Welcome back to Fight Network Boxing Weekly. Corey Erdman and Morgan Campbell here with you as we were discussing the return of Ike Ibeabuchi.
You know what? This is how they spin it.
Yeah.
Because as we were discussing,
we're talking about it.
We liked womanizing, hard drinking, pool hustling Manny Pacquiao much better than we like pious Manny Pacquiao.
That's right.
Who's just as sleazy as the old Manny Pacquiao, but now he just lies.
Get
to
the
us
no
about
fear
it.
trunks,
right?
And the frosted tips back.
Frosted tips. So maybe this is how they spin it. Because if Ibeabuchi goes out here and gets starched as we expect, then pious Manny Pacquiao can say, well, this is why we made this fight this way, because he needed some type of in-ring punishment for all the bad things he's done.
Listen, to put this into perspective, here's how long Ike Ibeabuchi has been in prison. The only picture that we have of him coming out of prison, Ike Ibeabuchi is wearing a champion crew neck, and not one of the champion sweaters that you can get, like the newfangled champion sweaters that you can get at like Target or at Foot Locker now, like the champion with the sewn on C down here on the wrist.
Ike Ibeabuchi has been in jail, in prison since those FUBU sweaters were popular.
Way before that.
The 05.
Before that.
That's how long that. Company, Rockaware, all these companies have risen and fallen in the time. Ike Ibeabuchi.
He didn't come on. I'm surprised he didn't come on like Jordache and an X shirt. Oh, man.
Ike Ibeabuchi's like, yo, you guys heard about this new rapper, Ja Rule?
Yeah. He can sing and rap.
A human time capsule.
You wouldn't believe it. We mentioned some other fights added to the HBO calendar, or are at least rumored to be coming up. We'll talk about one because it sort of does tie into the fact that Pacquiao and Bradley was announced last week.
Yes.
Terrence Crawford reportedly is going to be facing Hank Lundy in a couple months on HBO. So Crawford falls out of the Pacquiao sweepstakes, and a substantial step down to get to Hank Lundy. A very substantial step down. And I like Hank Lundy. I think that Hank Lundy, a great interview, maybe a guy that we don't have on the program, but many, many steps down from Manny Pacquiao, despite the fact that he's an entertaining television fighter.
I would be furious if I was Terrence Crawford. I would be furious because you went from the doorstep of a Manny Pacquiao pay-per-view payday to Hank Lundy.
Yeah.
No disrespect to Hank Lundy, but Hank Lundy has, if I remember correctly, has lost to some of the guys that Crawford has already beat.
Sure.
And now they're giving him to me for what? For what? And I understand, that we'll get to this in a minute, that every fight is not going to be a super fight. But HBO, Kellerman and the crew have spent the last 7 months building this guy up. He even got the Deadspin fighter profile.
Oh, yeah. The Daniel Roberts, this is the best fighter in the world.
Because no fighter is just great as far as Deadspin is concerned. If they take the time to write about you, it's because you're indestructible.
That's right.
And there can be no in-between.
And the future flag bearer of the sport.
Yes.
Yep.
He even got that treatment. And so he went from that to fighting Hank Lundy, who, good for an ESPN main event, a boxing after dark undercard. But is not a guy you think of as the guy as the opponent for a person who was just on the verge of making this Pacquiao fight.
No, but the response to this online has been very interesting, and you and I have been following this, of course. Now, usually when a fight like this is made, when you have a guy who is held in the regard that Terrence Crawford is, and he faces a guy like Hank Lundy, usually there's rabid backlash towards the fighter.
Yes.
Usually they say, why is he ducking Victor Postel? He wants to fight to fight Hank Lundy instead. Well, what a bum. Instead, we've seen some crazy things, such as one person's suggestion that this fight is being made because Al Heyman took all of the B-sides over to PBC, and so this is what's left. How is Al Heyman to blame for this fight being made? You could make any number of fights for Terrence Crawford. You could have made Terrence Crawford Manny Pacquiao. All the parties involved could have made any other fight happen other than Terrence Crawford and Hank Lundy. Do I think it's the worst fight in the world? No. But how in the world is this Al Heyman's fault?
I don't know, but if it is if people are blaming Al Heyman, we know that it has nothing to do with Al Heyman's race because.
Yes, boxing it's a post-racial society. We'll get into that a little bit later on, too.
We'll get further into that. And again, it just amazes me, too, how fans choose sides. Like, I know there are football fans north of the border in Canada that say, well, I like CFL, not the NFL.
Yeah, right.
Right? And they're very partisan about it.
Yeah.
But this is sort of like baseball fans south of the border where we are here in New York. Not just saying I prefer the Yankees over the Mets, but I prefer the American League to the National League.
Yeah.
Get out of here with
if you don't like the DH, you're a sucker.
Get out of here with your batting pitchers and double switches. No. American League, that's
Bunting.
real baseball.
Yeah, ridiculous.
Yes. And then if something goes wrong in the American League, we blame them. Well, if the National League didn't steal all the good pitchers, right, luring them with the chance to pitch to a pitcher every ninth batter so it deflates your ERA, if the National League wasn't stealing all the good pitchers, then the American League would be much better.
That's right.
I don't understand why fans and why media are so partisan.
Yeah.
I understand there's a promotional divide. Guys, I get it. Why you line up behind one promoter, one group of promoters, one manager versus another mystifies me.
And why does one side get to make excuses and the other does not?
Right.
If you're going to criticize this fight, or if you're going to criticize PBC fights, then criticize this fight.
Right.
In the same way. I mean, you both have to say, Al might have more fighters now, but also Top Rank has the rest of the world to pluck from as well.
Right. And who is Garcia fighting this month?
He's fighting Robert Guerrero.
Right. So why don't we blame HBO for the absence
of Terrence Crawford
of a quality foil,
right?
for Danny Garcia.
Why won't you free Timothy Bradley from his contract?
This would be a much better fight, except HBO signed all the A sides.
Yeah.
Right, so blame HBO for Garcia Guerrero. This is madness.
No, it is madness, and there are a number of other HBO fights that we're going to get into. We're going to hit the break in just a second, but there are a number of other HBO fights involving their flag bearers.
Yes,
their guys that they're lining up behind in some pretty unsavory matchups.
Yes.
And when we come back after the break, we'll reveal to you what some of those are if you haven't read them in the news already. We'll talk about that and plenty more. We'll be back shortly here on Fight Network Boxing Week. Welcome back to Fight Network Boxing Weekly. Corey Erdman and Morgan Campbell here with you. So apparently in today's boxing world, you either have to be a fan of PBC or of the fights on HBO. Yeah, basically, you have to choose one side or the other. And you can't watch the other, and you can only criticize one and not the other.
Right. I'm not gonna watch these fights, but I'm gonna criticize them without having seen them.
That's right.
Just because the other faction put them on. Now,
don't like them.
Now, neither of these sides are I don't work for either side. So what the hell do I look like lining up behind one side or another?
Exactly.
None of these guys are paying my bills.
Exactly.
Like you, at the very least, like you do work on PBC cards, but you won't trash HBO just because.
No, of course not.
And you will talk bad about a PBC mismatch.
Sure.
Because you should.
Of course.
So if Corey can do it, it's like I feel like Rocky at the end of Rocky 4. If I can change, you can change, anybody can change. Like if Corey can be nonpartisan, the rest of y'all can be too.
Listen, we've said this before, but basically everyone who is having this discussion has no dog in the fight whatsoever.
Right.
So why are you choosing sides like this?
Yes.
I don't understand. But, if you are on Team HBO, then you must really be excited about all of these A-side fighters in these super competitive matchups they have coming up, such as take on all-comers Canelo Alvarez facing either Gabe Rosado or Willie Monroe. Great 50-50 matchup there. What do you think, Morgan?
Well, as we were discussing a few weeks ago about Creed, this is really realistic. To get a shot at the middleweight title, you got to beat Gabe Rosado. Now, I don't necessarily mind those fights because, again, you go look back at the career record of Ray Leonard, Marvin Hagler, Thomas Hearns. Every fight wasn't a super fight, right? For every Thomas Hearns that Ray Leonard fought, there was a Larry Bonds, a Bruce Finch, whoever. That's fine, because you can't have a super fight every single time out. The difference, though, is that Golden Boy and HBO are telling us a fighter at that level has to have a super fight every single time out. And then anytime someone who's not under the promotional banner, or who is under the promotional banner but they just don't get along with, like Mayweather was before he jumped to Showtime, anytime he's engaged in something other than a super fight, well, then he's ducking the best competition.
Right.
He's padding his record on these old guys. And add to that Oscar De La Hoya's rant at the end of last month about all these things that Mayweather did. And again, we have an example of De La Hoya's fighter, Canelo Alvarez, doing the same things that De La Hoya complains about when other people do them. You look at, so let's say he fights Rosado.
Yep.
Beats Rosado.
Yep.
Right? And then Canelo's last 3 fights will have been 1 against Kirkland, completely shot. 2 against an old and undersized Cotto.
Mm-hmm. And Angulo before that, too.
Right. So hold on.
Shot to pieces Angulo.
Shot Angulo. Shot Kirkland.
Mm-hmm.
Pretty sharp, but old and outgunned Cotto. And then Rosado.
Yep.
Yeah, De La Hoya is complaining about other people not taking on the toughest challenges available to them. Now, we didn't know that Cotto would be as outgunned as he was. Like, on paper, that was a pretty even fight. But again, if you're Team Golden Boy, Team HBO, you can't complain about people in other camps not fighting the toughest competition when you're over here making these fights.
Yeah, of course. And you know, we like Gabe Rosado as well.
Right.
So let's put that caveat out there as well, just like Hank Lundy. But Gabe Rosado is a guy who couldn't beat J. Leon Love, couldn't beat Peter Quillen,
yes,
couldn't beat David Lemieux, who just got stopped by Triple G. I mean, I can give this a pass because, see, in making this fight, Golden Boy is going to admit one of 2 things. Either A, we're not matching him all that tough.
Yes.
Just because we don't feel like matching him all that tough right now. We want to get him a victory lap win of sorts with this middleweight title. Or we're going to admit that, yes, this guy isn't actually a full-blown middleweight. He has a middleweight title, but he won that at 155, and he needs to fight an actual middleweight, such as Gabe Rosado.
Right.
So you're going to admit one of 2 things. Either this middleweight title that you have isn't really what it seems, and you're going to kind of concede a little something to Triple G, or you're going to say, like we said, we're just kind of giving a little bit of a tune-up right here.
That's all it is.
Yeah.
And
one of those is true. You got to pick one, or both.
Well, and again, the argument we can't accept anymore is that Canelo is not a full-sized middleweight because the guy...
Or that he's not experienced enough. You had like 50 fights.
Right. Yeah, and they want it both ways, right? He's young, but he's experienced. He's got 50 fights. But you can't say he's not a middleweight when he was 175 pounds at least.
Sure, yeah.
Against Cotto. So let's not say that he's not a middleweight because he absolutely is a middleweight. He's just a middleweight.
Hasn't had to make middleweight. He hasn't had to step on the scales at 160.
Right. But he is, listen,
he's big enough.
Size is not a problem for him. Exactly. And I mean, if you sell this as a tune-up for a Triple G fight, fine. I think what they're trying to do too is get the common opponent, right? So that if what round did Triple G knock out?
I believe it was, I don't have box rec in front of me. I think it was the 10th that Billy Briscoe had to come in. Right?
UFC Canada President Tom Wright just walked into the office. I don't know what he's doing here in New York. Must be some really big business going on.
That's very strange.
Because MMA's not legal here in New York.
Breaking news here.
I don't know. But I think they maybe try to sell this again as the matchup of the common opponents. So if he looks better against Rosado or better against Monroe than Golovkin did, then you turn around and say, well, look what our guy did against the same person. Therefore, our guy is better. Pay us more when this fight actually happens.
Now, speaking of their flag bearers, Roman Gonzalez apparently has a fight on the docket now as well. That is reportedly going to take place in March in Los Angeles. We don't know the venue yet, but it is likely going to be against Giovanni Segura, who we haven't seen in action since 2014. Now, listen, Segura, a very exciting fighter, a guy who you want to see get every opportunity and every payday imaginable for all the years that they had to toil fighting
in obscurity.
This is a guy who came to the United States through abandoned sewer passages.
Yes.
I want him to make all the money possible. So this is not that. But this is also the number 1 pound-for-pound fighter in the world, who is basically in a gimme matchup again. And again, another example of an A-side on HBO. that isn't going to be matched particularly tough. And I don't know if that's from their lack of knowledge of the opponents out there in the lower weight classes.
These people, they work in boxing. They know who all the opponents are.
You would imagine so.
If you can find Giovanni Segura, you can find someone who's closer to the top of his game.
Sure, just open up BoxRec. Who's in the top 10? The 112.
Segura is.
Yeah.
And again, none of this would necessarily be a problem if the guys on HBO weren't at the same time railing about the perceived mismatches and lack of star power on the other side of the divide.
That's all I'm saying, yeah.
Right?
Because in and of itself, that's fine. Segura has been a world champion. He's earned the right to have a fight like this.
Right.
Totally fine.
And again, Chocolatito, you're not going to have a mega fight every time.
He's fought everybody, so it's not on Chocolatito.
Right.
He's fought everybody.
But it is a little bit troubling, that the crew at HBO wants to argue both sides of this divide. Now, if you're going to criticize the Heyman camp, PBC, Showtime for making matches that they don't think are stellar, then you can't then make these matches that are no more competitive than the same fights you criticized. And again, at least the Heyman side, they do try. Like Quillen versus Jacobs turned out to be a one-round whitewash, but on paper, that fight, matchmaking-wise, that was really even. It just turned out that way, which is very different from Gonzalez Segura, is very different from Monroe Canelo, very different from a second Pascal Kovalev fight.
Yes.
Right?
Which, a rematch that nobody asked for. Except Jean Pascal.
Yes, and somehow Jean Pascal has that kind of power where he can tell HBO what to do, and then they do it. Amazing.
Well, Jean Pascal is just out here fighting for all the black fighters in boxing because racist Sergey Kovalev is standing in the opposite corner. But racism doesn't exist.
There's no racism
in boxing. There is absolutely no racism in boxing. Floyd Mayweather thinks that there is, but everybody else seems to think that there isn't. We'll talk about that. We'll be right back here on Fight Network Boxing Weekly. Welcome back to Fight Network Boxing Weekly. Corey Erdman and Morgan Campbell here with you. And Morgan, I am so delighted that I work in an industry, in the sport of boxing, where racism does not exist. I have found out on boxing Twitter over the last couple days that it absolutely does not exist. Floyd Mayweather thinks that there's racism in the sport of boxing, but everyone else has proven him wrong. They've shown me the light, Morgan. There is no racism in the sport of boxing. Floyd Mayweather made a whole lot of money, so that means that racism is nowhere to be found in this sport. Nowhere.
Right. And so then when Sergey Kovalev calls Jean Pascal a monkey, or who did he call him?
Adonis.
When he calls Adonis Stevenson a monkey, he means that Stevenson has long arms.
That's right.
Nothing racial about it. Also, his trainer is black. Some of his best friends are black, so he can't be racist, right?
Nope.
That's how it works. Correct. You're referencing an interview that Floyd Mayweather did with which publication?
With Fight Hype, of course.
With Fight Hype,
yeah.
Yes, is all. And I love the Fight Hype because every time they do these exclusive interviews with Floyd Mayweather,
of course it's exclusive.
The lead is always a quote.
Yes.
Right. And so the lead might be, like I said before, it's hard work and dedication.
Right.
Said champion Floyd Mayweather. Blah blah blah. We have more details. So here's Mayweather talking about race in boxing, and how Andre Ward hasn't received, the promotional push that you would think a fighter of his caliber would have received. And how there's this push now for Ward to go fight Kovalev at Kovalev's weight, and Mayweather's saying, no. You're the man. You earned it. You make these other guys fight you at your weight. And Mayweather talks about the difference in how black fighters are promoted and perceived versus how white fighters are promoted and perceived.
And he specifically referenced Bernard Hopkins.
Yes.
When he was trying to fight De La Hoya and Trinidad and Mosley and all those guys, people said, hey, he's picking on the little guys.
Right.
And he was trying to fight the best fighters.
Yes.
Says. Yeah.
And here comes Kovalev saying, hey, why don't I fight this 165-pound fighter? 168-pound fighter. One of the things that
what a risk he's trying to take.
Oh, here goes CFL Canada president, UFC Canada president.
That's right,
Tom Wright. All the way down here in luxurious New York, amazing. But Mayweather, and he talks about Golovkin, and one of the things he says about Golovkin, it says, he's straight up and down, no special effects. You hear Mayweather say that a lot. Straight up and down, no special effects. Continuously, that statement. Straight up and down, comma, no special effects. You know where that comes from? That was an LL Cool J song. I think it was in hip-hop historians, feel free to correct me. I think the song was called 357. I'm the hardest hard rock in a hard rock town. I got a 357 and I break it on down. I think it was that song. It's off that album, Bigger and Deafer Reason. Straight up and down, no special effects. For whatever reason, that's become imprinted in his brain, and he keeps talking about it. Here's the thing about, and so now this precipitates this Twitter exchange between some guy and then Steve Kim, who works for Ring TV and whoever.
Variety of places, yeah.
Yes. Where the guy says Mayweather got $32 million per fight, but boxing holds the blacks back. Hold back the blacks. The thing about 2015 racism, 2016 racism, sorry, is that it's not like it was, 110 years ago where people just used like racial slurs. Like you could read it in the newspaper, like in the Toronto Star, called Joe Gans a goon.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah,
a coon.
This isn't a Tarantino movie.
Yeah, you can't do that. But
right.
A clue to whether or not someone is racist often is found in use of the phrase the blacks. Mm-hmm. If you have a white friend who calls black people the blacks, pretty good chance that guy's racist. And Steve Kim's reply is, well, if not for racism, Mayweather would have made $57 million per fight. Now,
and he's made a couple jokes along those lines as well. He called him Farrakhan Mayweather as well.
I don't even know what that's supposed to mean.
I don't know what it's supposed to mean either.
I don't even know what that's supposed to mean. But I will tell you this. When we talk about racism in boxing, you talk about boxing like this, like it's just amorphous thing. And it's the same way when people talk about, well, the media. Well, which media? Right. So you can go on down the line to every single promoter, every single manager. Every single one of them will tell you, no, I'm not racist. Look, I manage black fighters. Look, I manage Mexicans. Some of those guys might be from there. Some of my Mexicans are from Nicaragua, whatever.
Right.
So every single person will tell you that they individually are not racist. They personally are not racist. And they might all believe it. Doesn't mean that racism doesn't shape and racial bias doesn't shape which fights are made, how fighters are promoted, how fighters are marketed. Mayweather is keenly aware of this. And the thing and the irony here is that racism is alive and well among the audience for many sports, boxing included. So even if every fighter isn't racist or none of these managers individually call themselves racist like they did back in the day, doesn't mean that race and the audience's racial biases don't influence the fights that are made, the fighters that are promoted, and how fights are marketed.
Well, and I would argue that that racial bias and race is exploited and used more in boxing than any other sport.
Yes, by
boxing is racism.
Yes,
in a lot of ways. And listen, boxing has been a vessel for racial progress in certain circumstances throughout history.
It's also a proxy for different racial conflicts.
Exactly. Yes. So it has gone both ways. Yes.
Usually at the same time.
Usually at the same time. So when Joe Louis, is propped up as a black hero in a time when there were no others,
right.
It also spawned a whole wave of racism at the very same time. When Muhammad Ali was, again, in a lot of ways, what Joe Louis was, but even greater and more vocal about it. He himself was also a race baiter and also a magnet for racism himself.
Well, right. And so it's Mayweather points out that there's racism in boxing, but at the same time, no fighter has benefited more from the racism of boxing's from the racial biases of boxing's audience. Yeah. No fighter has benefited more from that than Floyd Mayweather, because he and his camp, they consciously exploited racial
Which doesn't mean it doesn't exist.
Right. No, it means it does exist.
They took your money.
Right. In the same way that we mentioned Jack Johnson last week, same way Jack Johnson did it. So you stoke racial animus. You yourself play into stereotypes, inflame mainstream, mostly white, sometimes Mexican hatred against you to get people to buy the fight, because inevitably, because they hate you, they think they can hate you so much that the other guy becomes better than you are. And if you don't think it's about, because Mayweather beats up his girlfriends, it's kind of become popular to say, well, no, people don't hate Floyd Mayweather because he's black. They hate Floyd Mayweather because he beats his girlfriends. But 5 years ago, Mayweather still had girlfriends he beat up and no one cared.
Right.
But the dynamic...
It's become a smokescreen for why you hate Floyd Mayweather.
Right. And if it was, again, as we've mentioned many times, if it was about hating violence against women, you wouldn't line up behind Manny Pacquiao either.
Or Diego Corrales or any number of... I mean, listen.
Right.
This is a stretch, but I mean, there are a lot of fighters... because they fight people for a living who have problems with violence outside of the ring, and not all the time, but sometimes.
Often enough that it's
a trend.
Right. Well, and often enough that
it stems to their spouses.
Right.
Or
and
to
often,
women.
And often enough that you can't use it. You can't use it as a reason to hate one guy over the next guy.
Exactly. Yes.
Right? Because if it's about respect for women, then you wouldn't cheer for womanizing Manny Pacquiao, who doesn't want people to have access to birth control.
That's right.
Who has now signed a
Ibeabuchi.
promotional contract with a convicted rapist.
Yeah.
Right? So when Mayweather talks about how different fighters are perceived, same set of actions, whether it's like if a white fighter had executed Mayweather's game plan the way he did, they would say this is smart business. With Mayweather, it's you're ducking people. You're cynically stealing our money. He's not cynically stealing your money. He's just playing on your biases to get you to hate him and love the other guy and make him richer, which isn't different from what Jack Johnson did. And the fact that Mayweather could do this in the 2000s and execute a very similar game plan to the one that worked for Jack Johnson in 1908.
When he was the highest paid fighter in the world.
When he was the highest paid fighter in the world.
And so you're going to tell me that just because Jack Johnson was the highest paid fighter in the world at the time, that there was no racism in boxing.
Right. Jack Johnson was the highest paid fighter in the world precisely because there was racism. And especially with the Jim Jeffries fight, people paid a lot of money to see someone knock this guy off. And then when it didn't happen, then there's the backlash. You know what? Maybe we should ban boxing. At the very least, let's ban... Let's ban the interstate transmission of fight films.
Turn the cameras off.
Right, because we don't want people to watch Jeffries getting knocked out. But all these things are a function of racism. And the thing is, just Mayweather exploits them today. And again, the fact that you can have a similar blueprint in 2015 as Jack Johnson had in 1908, when again, they could just call you a coon in the newspaper. A reporter could call you a coon in the newspaper, and people would think that's normal.
Yeah.
Tells you which of these dynamics are still at work.
Well, we'll touch on this a little bit more when we come back. We got to hit the break real quick. We'll be back with more boxing talk here on Fight Network Boxing Weekly. Welcome back to Fight Network Boxing Weekly. Corey Erdman and Morgan Campbell here with you in the post-racial world of boxing. How much different would the very correct assessment that racism exists in boxing, just as it exists everywhere, how much different would this have been received if, say, Bernard Hopkins came out and said this? And Hopkins has come out and said this.
Not that different.
Didn't get this reaction.
No, he's not as polarizing a figure, but he also not that different because he's a black guy saying it now. If a white guy says it, suddenly it's not complaining; it's incredible insight.
Right? Yeah.
Right. It's because the same thing happens in baseball, like when a Latino player or a black player flips the bat, and all these crusty old sports writers flip out, and then someone like me says, "Hey, wait a minute. There's a double standard going on here," and people say, yeah, whatever. But now Ken Rosenthal says it.
Right.
Oh, wait a minute. We've been treating these Latino players unfairly for showing emotion.
Look, Bryce Harper's doing the same thing.
Right.
Yeah.
But now, like when Ken Rosenthal says it, it gets traction. Right. In other of these manifestations, and again, we talk about racism. No, it's not 1915. You can't just call a guy a racial slur. But if you look close enough, you can see how it's manifested. One of the manifestations of this is, again, this idea that boxing is a dead sport. Boxing is dying. Boxing is dead. Look at the numbers in the U.S. So at the very least, that's a xenophobic statement. Because, again, you look at Europe, boxing is as big as it's ever been. You look at Central and South America, Asia, it's a huge deal. But now you've had a group of people saying, well, if it's not as big as it used to be in the United States, therefore it's dying. Well, The world is bigger than the United States. So at the very least, it's xenophobic. But even when you look at within the United States, a lot of Spanish-speaking immigrants to the United States come from these different countries, but all of them are big fans of boxing. A lot of Puerto Ricans aren't necessarily immigrants because they're U.S. citizens.
Yeah.
But they come to the mainland United States. Big groups of boxing fans in Florida and New York. People come from Mexico, Nicaragua, Cuba, all countries where boxing is big, and they come to the United States and they bring this love of boxing with them. So when you say boxing is a dead sport, well, no, it's very big in these various Spanish-speaking communities that constitute a larger and larger part of the American population every year. So to say that boxing is dead basically erases and ignores the sports preferences of a huge part of the American population.
Yes.
So to say boxing is dead is to say Mexican Americans, Nicaraguan Americans, Cuban Americans, Puerto Rican Americans don't count.
Well, and therein lies also some of the ignorance in suggesting that racism doesn't exist here, or that Floyd is a liar, or that because Floyd is making money, that racism mustn't exist. Because those same people, if you ask them, the stock answer when people, when you start talking about why is boxing dead, when people say, well, African Americans don't support their own. They don't pay money to go and see their own fighters. Well, if that's the case, if what you're saying is true, who the hell is paying to see these Floyd Mayweather fights? Other than people who want to see him lose because they don't like him.
Right. Well, there's both, right? There's people that line up behind him because they want him to win. There's people that line up behind him because they want him to lose.
In both cases, the sport's alive. Right.
And again, that's how Mayweather, he had a lot more fans stoking. He had a lot more attention, a lot more paying customers by stoking racial animus than he would have been if he'd been the guy who kept wearing the sweaters, because the good guy fighter always wears the sweaters. Yep. That's why I'm wearing the cardigan today. I'm
good guy.
I'm the good guy.
I'm wearing a sweater too. We're both good guys.
Yeah, but you got the backwards hats.
That's true. Yeah,
the heel. But because remember, Pretty Boy Floyd. What did the market think of Pretty Boy Floyd? Pretty Boy Floyd Mayweather
was exciting as hell.
Yes, that's the thing. Pretty Boy Floyd Mayweather. Well, he was aggressive Mayweather, but the market said, "Huh?" And Bob Arum said, "Yeah, you know what? You can buy me out of this contract for $750,000." That was Pretty Boy Floyd. But when he became Arrogant Money Mayweather and the guy who embodied everything that so much of mainstream America hates about young black men, all of a sudden his paydays he goes from 320 pay-per-views sold, 2 million against De La Hoya, another million against Ricky Hatton. All of a sudden this guy has money in the bank, and these two things are not just correlated. There's a causal relationship between Mayweather turning heel, Mayweather playing to racial biases in the audience, in the market, and Mayweather making more money than any other fighter before him or after.
I will say one thing, and clearly Floyd does believe this. Floyd did say the majority of this. However, to my knowledge, there hasn't been video released of this this conversation. So one part of his answer, he starts listing all of these fighters.
Come on, man.
Listen, Floyd does not know who Richard Comey is. He doesn't know who Sharif Bogaree is. He sure as hell didn't mention Leo Santa Cruz. I don't know what he has to do with this. He certainly knows who Andrew Tabiti is because he's his own guy.
Yeah.
But
James DeGale,
he doesn't know who these people are. Floyd didn't say these things.
The list, all at the top of his head.
Yeah, all off the top of his head.
How? And Mayweather, to list all these fighters off the top of his head, when any other time you ask him about any other fighter that's not part of his promotional team, he'll say, "Who's he?"
Right.
Larry Holmes. Who's he? Did I fight him? Right. Every other time he's like, "I don't care who you beat out."
Earlier on in the interview, he's struggling to name the number 9 pound for pound fighter, who I think is Takashi Uchiyama. He's like, "I don't know. It's that Japanese guy."
Right. Or he doesn't. Or he can't remember Kovalev's name.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, right.
You know that guy, Kovalo. He wants to fight Kovalo, the Russian. But suddenly he has this moment of clarity and just lists
30 fighters in a row.
All these obscure guys. Yeah, Shavar Henry, Lyndon Chambers, all these guys.
These guys are fighting on like CBS Sports. I know you're not watching this.
Right.
Give me a break. All right, coming up after the break, we're gonna give you some stuff that you do want to watch. We're gonna add to our YouTube Classics playlist. We'll get that going when we return here on Fight Network Boxing Weekly. Welcome back to Fight Network Boxing Weekly. Corey Erdman and Morgan Campbell here with you. It is time to add to our YouTube Classics playlist. We do this every single week. Last week, we added some little guy wars onto the list. And Morgan, I have a feeling you might add some big men this week.
Yes. So in honor of the fact that race and racism don't play in the marketing of boxing at all, my pick this week, 1989, George Foreman versus Jerry Cooney. And if you think that the enduring appeal of Jerry Cooney and the fact that Jerry Cooney was made a favorite in all these comeback fights has anything to do with the fact that he was a white American heavyweight, you're wrong, because there is no racism in boxing.
I am going to add, only since I'm looking at this right here, a full color pinup of WBA junior lightweight champion Rocky Lockridge. I'm going to add a Rocky Lockridge fight because a lot of you out there might only know Rocky Lockridge as the guy with the very long cry on Intervention.
The guy from Intervention.
You might also know him as the homeless man who knocks out another homeless man outside of the convenience store. But before that, Rocky Lockridge was a real badass in the ring, and he had one of the best fights ever in 1988 against Tony Lopez, two guys with 15-round stamina going at it like they had 15-round stamina. An absolute classic from Sacramento in 1988. Definitely check that one out.
And if you get time, the next fight that'll probably show up on the suggestions is Rocky Lockridge versus Roger Mayweather, Floyd's uncle. Watch that too, because it won't take long.
It doesn't take long. Lockridge gave Chavez Sr. hell as well. Yes. Definitely get your hands on that one as well. Split decision. We have to wrap things up, though. We'll be back next week. For Morgan Campbell, I'm Corey Erdman. We'll see you guys next week.